The lobby of Cole Enterprises had seen plenty of crises. Hostile takeovers, market collapses, the kind of emergencies that sent executives reaching for phones and lawyers. But nothing had ever stopped the building the way this did, a child's screaming echoing off 40 feet of Italian marble, while the most powerful woman in the city stood helpless, her composure finally cracked open for everyone to see. Vivian Cole had just offered $750,000 to anyone who could make it stop. Every specialist in the room had already failed. Then a janitor set down his mop bucket and walked over. If stories like this one stay with you, the kind where the person nobody notices turns out to be the one who understands the most, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Marcus Williams had worked the morning shift at Cole Enterprises for 8 years, and in that time he had learned one thing above all else. The building had its own rhythm. He knew it the way a sailor knows the sea, not by thinking about it, but by feeling it underfoot. The lobby filled up between 8 and 8:30, thinned out by 9, and stayed quiet until the lunch crowds pushed through the glass doors again. He knew which elevator made a grinding sound on the way to the 14th floor. He knew which bathroom on the 3rd floor had a slow drain. He knew all of this the way invisible men always know the places they inhabit completely, and without credit. Most mornings he arrived before the sun hit the east windows, wheeled his cart to the service entrance, and started on the marble floors while they were still empty. The work was honest. It asked nothing of him except attention, and attention was something Marcus gave freely because it cost him nothing and had never once let him down. By the time the executives arrived in their tailored suits and sharp shoes, the floors they walked across were already clean. They never looked down. They never looked at him. That was fine. That had always been fine. There was one thing people might have noticed about Marcus if they had ever thought to look. Each morning before he clocked in, he reached into the front pocket of his jacket and checked that it was still there. A small toy car the size of a matchbox painted a deep shade of blue with one rear wheel slightly bent from an old fall. He never took it out during the day. He never explained it to anyone. His coworker Darnell had asked once years ago, and Marcus had only smiled and said it was for good luck. Darnell had nodded and let it go, because men like them had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be pressed. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was running his floor buffer along the far side of the lobby when Vivian Cole walked through the main entrance. He recognized her the way he recognized all the executives by the way the space around them changed. People straightened up. Conversations dropped to a lower register. Her heels clicked against the marble in a pace that did not waver, and she wore the expression of someone who had not allowed themselves an unscheduled moment in years. She was followed by 2 assistants, a security detail, and this was different. A boy walking slightly behind her, one hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching it. Marcus noted the boy the way he noted everything quietly without making it a production. He turned his buffer to the next section and kept working. Vivian Cole had built Cole Enterprises from a regional consulting firm into a global operation worth several $billion, and the industry press liked to describe her in the kind of language usually reserved for weather systems and military campaigns. Decisive, relentless, formidable. She had been photographed on the covers of business magazines enough times that her face had become a kind of symbol not just of herself, but of a particular idea about what a woman with power was supposed to look like. Controlled, unassailable, always prepared. What the magazine profiles did not tend to mention was that for the past 8 years, a significant portion of her income had gone toward a rotating team of specialists, therapists, behavioral consultants, and support workers, all organized around the care of her son Eli. The profiles did not mention it because Vivian did not discuss it, and because the world she moved in had a way of erasing the parts of people that didn't fit the frame. She had accepted this trade long ago. Privacy in exchange for the appearance of wholeness. It seemed like a reasonable deal until the mornings when it didn't. This was one of those mornings. Her regular childcare worker had called at 6:45 to say she had a fever and couldn't come in. The backup was unreachable. Vivian had a board presentation at 10 and a conference call with investors in Frankfurt at noon, and she stood in her kitchen for 4 full minutes, which was by her standards an eternity, running through options and finding none of them workable. In the end, she made the only decision available to her. She brought Eli with her and told herself it would be fine. She told herself this the entire drive over. She told herself this in the elevator. She was still telling herself this when they stepped into the lobby, and the building hit Eli all at once. The smell of cleaning solution, the hum of the overhead lights, the hard echo of 100 footsteps on stone, and the particular quality of the air in large corporate spaces that has been recycled so many times it carries no scent of anything living. Eli had been doing well lately. She had been cautiously hopeful. But hope in her experience had a way of choosing the worst possible moments to run out. It started as a low sound, a kind of pressurized humming barely audible beneath the noise of the lobby. Vivian knew that sound. She touched his shoulder and he flinched away from her hand, which he rarely did, which meant it was already further along than she'd caught it. She steered him toward a bench along the side wall, speaking to him in the low, measured voice she had spent years learning to keep steady. Around them, people were slowing down, glancing over, performing the particular cruelty of public observation that they probably didn't recognize as cruel. By the time her assistant had reached Dr. Sandra Price, the lead behavioral specialist on Eli's support team, the humming had become something else entirely. Eli was on his feet, his back against the wall, the sound coming out of him in waves that rolled through the lobby and stopped conversations on every floor connected to the atrium. It was not a tantrum. Anyone who understood what they were looking at would have known immediately that it was not a tantrum. But the lobby of Cole Enterprises was filled with people who did not understand what they were looking at, and so what they saw was chaos, and chaos made them useless. Dr. Price arrived within 7 minutes, which was genuinely fast. She was followed by 2 members of her team and a woman named Rebecca, who served as Eli's one-on-one aide. They moved with the calm efficiency of people who were used to being called into difficult situations, and they surrounded Eli with exactly the kind of structured professional response that training and experience had taught them to provide. They spoke to him. They used the protocols. They kept their voices level and their movements slow and deliberate. None of it worked. With each new approach, each careful technique, Eli's distress climbed another register. He was not responding to their voices. He was not tracking their faces. He was somewhere far inside himself trying to communicate something that nobody in the circle around him was receiving, and the failure of that communication was compounding the original crisis until the two were indistinguishable. Vivian stood at the edge of the circle and felt something she almost never allowed herself to feel in this building: complete and total helplessness. She had resources. She had a team. She had spent years constructing a support system designed precisely for moments like this one. And it was failing. Publicly, visibly, irreversibly failing, with 40 or 50 employees now gathered at a respectful distance in the atrium, watching the most powerful person in the company stand at the center of something she could not fix. 40 minutes passed. The sounds in the lobby had not diminished. If anything, they had begun to take on a quality of exhaustion that was somehow worse than the original urgency. A raw, cycling desperation that made several people in the crowd look at the floor because they could not stand to hear it anymore. It was Rebecca who finally said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear that they had tried everything in the protocol, that they needed to give Eli time and space, that the best course of action at this point was to wait. Something broke open in Vivian's face when she heard that. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in the set of her jaw. But it was the first unguarded thing she had shown the room, and everyone watching recognized it for what it was. She looked at the crowd around her, at the specialists who had no more answers, at the marble floors and the 40 feet of corporate air above her head, and then she said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it carried. $750,000, Vivian Cole said, to anyone in this building who can help my son. The offer landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed it was different from the silence before, charged, uncertain, full of people calculating and concluding and deciding they were not qualified. Dr. Price looked at Vivian with an expression that was difficult to read. The assistants looked at their phones. Nobody moved. Nobody except Marcus Williams, who had stopped his floor buffer 6 minutes earlier and had been standing near the service hallway at the edge of the atrium watching. Not watching the crowd, not watching Vivian, watching Eli. He watched the way the boy's right hand moved against the wall behind him, a rhythmic tapping, 4 beats a rest, 4 beats again. He watched the direction of the boy's gaze, which was not unfocused the way people assumed, but locked onto a specific point in the ceiling above the left side of the lobby. He watched the pattern in the sounds, not random, not escalating, but cycling, repeating like a signal sent over and over by someone who believed, despite all evidence that someone on the other end was eventually going to pick up. Marcus had seen this before. He had seen it 10,000 times before in a different room in a different life when the person sending the signal was someone whose face he still saw every single morning before he opened his eyes. He stood very still for a long moment. He thought about what it would look like a man in a maintenance uniform walking out of the service hallway into the middle of a situation that had already defeated a team of credentialed specialists. He thought about the security guard near the east entrance and Dr. Price and the crowd of employees. He thought about all of it clearly and without self-pity, and then he reached down and wheeled his cart back toward the wall out of the way. He took the small blue car from his jacket pocket and held it for just a moment in his closed fist. Then he put it back, straightened his collar, and walked out into the lobby. He walked without hurrying. He walked the way he always walked, like a man who belonged exactly where he was, which was the one performance that the invisible had perfected over generations. He crossed the open floor of the atrium and moved through the outer edge of the crowd, and a few people stepped aside automatically before they had even processed who was stepping through. He was nearly at the inner ring before anyone really noticed him, and by then he had already stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the circle around Eli, and for a moment he simply looked. Not at the boy in the way the others were looking, with assessment, with strategy, with the professional remove of people trying to solve a problem. He looked the way you look at someone you recognize. The way you look when something you thought was gone turns around and is suddenly improbably standing right in front of you. Then he turned to Vivian Cole. She was staring at him with an expression that had not yet settled into anything. Not dismissal, not invitation, just the raw and open-faced confusion of someone who had run out of frameworks. "Ma'am," Marcus said. His voice was even and quiet, the kind of voice that doesn't need to compete with the noise around it. "I'd like to try something if you'll let me." The security guard near the east entrance moved first. He was a broad-shouldered man named Curtis, who had worked the lobby detail for 3 years and took his responsibilities seriously, which meant he was already stepping forward before Marcus had finished his sentence. Curtis put himself between Marcus and the inner circle with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this particular kind of intervention many times, even if never quite in these circumstances. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," Curtis said. His tone was not unkind, but it was final. "This situation is being handled by a medical team. You need to return to your work area." Marcus did not step back. He also did not escalate. He simply stood where he was and kept his eyes on Vivian Cole because she was the only person in the room whose opinion actually mattered right now, and they both knew it. Dr. Price moved to Vivian's side. She was a composed woman in her mid-40s who had spent 2 decades in behavioral therapy and had seen enough of human desperation to recognize when someone was grasping at anything available. She spoke in the low measured register she used with anxious parents, the voice calibrated to sound like reason itself. "Ms. Cole, I understand this is incredibly difficult, but introducing an unknown variable at this stage could destabilize the situation further. We have a plan. We need to give it more time." More time. Vivian looked at the specialist who had been giving Eli more time for the past 40 minutes, and then she looked at Marcus Williams, who was watching her with an expression of absolute patience, as though he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. There was something in that stillness that did not match the urgency around him, and it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately explain. She had built a career on reading rooms and reading people, and what she was reading from this man was not desperation or opportunism. It was recognition. Like he had seen this before. Like he was waiting for her to see what he was already seeing. Eli's voice cycled through another wave, raw and repeating, and the sound of it moved through Vivian's chest the way it always did, like a hand reaching in and closing around something vital. She looked at her son, and then she looked back at Marcus, and she made a decision that every rational framework she possessed argued against. "Let him through," Vivian said. Curtis looked at her. Dr. Price looked at her. Half the crowd looked at her. Vivian did not repeat herself because she never repeated herself, and after a moment Curtis stepped aside. Marcus walked into the center of the circle and then did something that nobody expected. He turned around and addressed the entire group, the specialists, the assistants, the security detail, the watching crowd in the same quiet, unhurried voice he'd used from the start. I need everyone to move back at least 5 yards and stay there. No talking, no phones out, nobody looks directly at him. He said it the way a man gives instructions when he is not asking for agreement, but simply describing what is going to happen next. Then he turned back to Vivian specifically. That means everyone, ma'am, including you. I need you to step back and let me work. For a woman who had not taken a directive from anyone in years without first evaluating whether it served her interests, the fact that Vivian Cole stepped back without argument said more than anything else that happened that morning. She moved to the outer ring of the circle, and the specialists and assistants reshuffled around her, including Rebecca, who had been standing closest to Eli, and the watching crowd, responding to some collective instinct, quieted and pulled back. Marcus did not go to Eli immediately. Instead, he stood in the newly cleared space and took a long, slow look at the lobby, the ceiling, the walls, the overhead lighting grid. He was not performing. He was looking for something specific, moving his gaze in careful sections, the way a person scans a room when they know exactly what they're trying to find, but don't want to miss it by moving too fast. He found it after about 30 seconds, a fluorescent panel on the left side of the atrium ceiling roughly 20 feet above the spot on the wall where Eli was standing. It was flickering. Not dramatically, not the kind of obvious strobing that would have prompted someone to call maintenance. It was a subtle, irregular pulse, the kind that registered in the peripheral vision as a vague wrongness rather than an identifiable problem. Most people in the room had been in the building long enough that their brains had already filtered it out. But filtering required effort, and effort had limits. And for someone whose sensory system was already running at maximum load, that light was not background noise. That light was everything. Marcus recognized it immediately. He had submitted a work order for that panel 2 weeks earlier, and it had not yet been fixed. Standing in the lobby now, watching where Eli's gaze was locked, he felt the pieces align in a way that made his chest go tight. He lowered himself to the floor. Not carefully, not with the hesitation of someone protecting their knees or their dignity, he sat down. The way you sit down. When sitting down is simply the most direct route to where you need to be cross-legged on the cold marble, positioning himself about 4 feet from Eli and slightly to the side so that he was within the boy's sight line without being directly in front of him. He did not speak. He did not reach toward Eli. He did not make eye contact. He rested his hands on his knees and looked at a point on the floor in the middle distance, and then he began to tap. His right thumb against his knee, 4 beats a rest, 4 beats again. The same rhythm that Eli's hand had been making against the wall for the past 20 minutes. The same rhythm that Marcus had heard from across the lobby before he'd ever decided to step forward. The effect was not immediate, but it was real. Eli's voice dropped half a register. Not silent, not close to silent, but different in the way that a conversation sounds different when someone on the other end finally picks up the phone. The cycling pattern of sound shifted almost imperceptibly, and anyone who didn't know to listen for it would have missed the change entirely. Marcus heard it. His thumb kept its rhythm without breaking. From the outer ring of the circle, Vivian watched. She had her arms crossed over her chest in the posture she used when she was trying to hold herself still, and her eyes had not moved from the 2 figures in the center of the lobby since the moment Marcus sat down. Beside her, Dr. Price was also watching, and the expression on the specialist's face was something Vivian had never seen there before. Not dismissal, and not professional skepticism, but a concentrated, almost unwilling attention, the look of someone revising a conclusion they had already committed to. Minutes passed. The lobby existed in a suspended state, 40 or 50 people holding their breath around a center point that had stopped following the rules they'd all expected. Marcus was still watching the same point on the floor, still tapping, but his attention was fully on Eli, on the direction of the boy's gaze, on the small shifts in his posture on the way his fingers moved against the wall. He was reading something and reading it carefully, the way you read something written in a language that took years to learn, and that you have not had reason to use in a very long time. He confirmed what he already suspected when he tracked Eli's gaze to its endpoint. The boy was not staring at the ceiling randomly. His eyes were locked on the flickering light with the fixed, helpless intensity of someone who cannot look away from the thing that is hurting them. His hand against the wall was not agitation. It was a signal. 4 beats. Arrest. 4 beats again. The same rhythm, the same direction, the same communication repeated over and over for 40 minutes to a room full of adults who were all looking at him, but none of them were looking where he was looking. Something moved through Marcus's chest that he did not have a name for anymore. He had put a name to it once, a long time ago, in a different room with a different boy, and when that boy was gone, the name had gone with him. What was left was something quieter and more enduring, not grief, exactly, though it lived in the same place. More like the permanent weight of knowing something that cost you everything to learn. He understood now exactly what was happening, and exactly what needed to happen next. The light needed to go off. That was the practical solution, and it would take 60 seconds once he flagged it to the facilities team. But the practical solution was not the only thing needed here. Eli had been sending a signal for 40 minutes to people who didn't receive it, and that failure had compounded on itself until the original problem was buried under layers of distress and the overwhelming sensation of not being heard. What Eli needed before anything else could be addressed was for someone to tell him that the signal had finally arrived. Marcus had only one way to do that. He had used it before in another life, and he had not used it since because after the reason for it was gone, he had not been able to find a way to say it that didn't feel like reaching into an empty room. But the reason was not gone. The reason was in every room he had ever walked into with that small blue car in his pocket, and every morning he had ever started by checking that it was still there. The reason was sitting 4 feet away from him on a cold marble floor, tapping 4 beats against a wall and waiting for the world to finally pay attention. Marcus leaned forward, slowly reducing the distance enough that what he said next would go to Eli and no one else. He kept his voice at the register just above a whisper, the register that carries warmth without volume, that reaches the ear without filling the room. He said a single word: Noah. It was not Eli's name. Everyone close enough to hear it would have understood that it was not Eli's name. It was the name that Marcus carried in his jacket pocket every morning, the name attached to the small blue car, the name that belonged to the boy who had taught him everything he knew about listening to people who couldn't use words to be heard. He said it not as a greeting and not as an accident, but as the only honest thing he had available, an acknowledgement that he understood, that the signal had been received, that someone was finally on the other end of the line. Eli's hand stopped tapping against the wall. His head turned a small, deliberate movement until his eyes found Marcus's face. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the man sitting cross-legged on the marble floor and the boy leaning against the wall, and in that moment, there was nothing transactional, nothing clinical, nothing that belonged to the language of specialists and protocols and managed interventions. There was only the specific and irreplaceable quality of being seen by someone who means it. Then Eli went quiet. Not gradually, not in the slow descending pattern that the specialist had been working toward for 40 minutes. He went quiet the way a storm goes quiet completely, and all at once with the sudden totality of something that has finally run out of need. The sound stopped and the lobby received the silence, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke, because the silence was too significant to interrupt. Curtis, the security guard, let out a breath he had been holding for longer than he realized. 2 of the assistants near the back of the crowd exchanged a glance that contained several things none of them were going to say out loud. Dr. Price stood completely still with her hands at her sides, looking at a man sitting on a floor and no longer having anything to say about it. Vivian Cole's arms had dropped from their crossed position at her chest. She was standing with them at her sides, her composure not so much broken as simply absent, not performed, not managed. Just a woman in the middle of her own lobby, undone, and not yet sure what to do with that. She was looking at Marcus with the particular expression of someone who has just watched a thing happen that they do not have a category for. Marcus got up from the floor without ceremony. He stood, straightened his uniform jacket, and then looked toward the ceiling, toward the flickering light, and back at the lobby, until his eyes found a man in a gray facilities shirt near the service corridor. "That panel up there needs to come down," Marcus said, nodding toward the left side of the atrium ceiling. "Third one from the column. It's been running a bad cycle." The facilities worker looked up, squinted, and nodded. "I'll get someone up there." Marcus turned back to the center of the lobby where Vivian was already moving toward him, crossing the empty floor with the focused, purposeful stride of a woman who had just reorganized her entire understanding of a situation and was walking directly toward the new center of it. Vivian Cole had spent 20 years learning how to walk into a room. It was not something she had ever been taught explicitly. No mentor had sat her down and explained it, but she had absorbed it the way you absorb everything that determines your survival in a particular world, by watching who got taken seriously and who didn't, and then adjusting accordingly. The walk was deliberate. The expression was controlled. The pace communicated that whatever was in front of her was already within her capacity to handle. She had walked into boardrooms and courtrooms and rooms full of people who did not want her there, and she had walked the same way in all of them. She walked toward Marcus Williams now with that same stride, and it was only when she reached him and stopped that something in the architecture of her expression gave way, not collapsed but softened in the manner of a structure that has been under load for a very long time and has finally been allowed to rest. "Tell me your name," she said. Not the way she asked for names in meetings cataloging people for future reference. She said it the way you ask when you genuinely want to know. "Marcus Williams," he said. "I run maintenance on floors 1 through 6. Vivian looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite an apology, and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between them. Then she said, "How did you do that?" Marcus did not answer immediately. Around them, the lobby was beginning to reassemble itself, the crowd dispersing with the slightly dazed quality of people returning from a collective suspension, assistants moving back toward their stations, the facilities worker already on a ladder near the atrium ceiling. Rebecca had guided Eli to a quieter corner near the side wall away from the foot traffic where he sat without sound. Dr. Price had not left. She stood at a short distance, close enough to hear with the expression of a person who has decided that whatever professional dignity requires in this moment leaving is not it. "The light," Marcus said, nodding toward the panel being examined above them. "Third one from the column on the left. It's been cycling on a frequency that doesn't show up as a flicker if you're looking straight at it. But if your senses are already running high, it's like a drill going through the side of your head." He wasn't in crisis because of the noise or the crowd. He was in crisis because he'd been trying to tell someone about that light for 40 minutes, and nobody was looking where he was pointing. Vivian's eyes went to the ceiling. The facilities worker had the panel open now and was frowning at whatever he found inside. Then her eyes came back down and went to Eli across the lobby, and the look on her face in that moment was one she would not have permitted herself here under any other circumstances, raw and unguarded, and full of a grief that had nothing to do with today, specifically because it was the accumulated grief of every signal she had missed across all the days before this one. "I've been in this building every day for 8 years, Marcus said, his voice quiet enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. "I know every sound it makes. The light started going bad about 2 weeks ago. I put in a work order." He was not saying it to excuse himself. He was saying it because it was true, and because the truth mattered more right now than making anyone feel better. "It should have been fixed before today." Vivian absorbed this. Then she said, "That's not what I was asking. I was asking how you knew what he needed, the way you sat with him, the rhythm." She watched Marcus carefully. "That wasn't something you figured out in the moment." Marcus looked at her steadily. When he spoke, it was not with the performance of a man delivering a revelation, but with the flatness of someone stating a fact they have lived with for so long that it no longer requires dramatic framing. "I had a son," he said. "His name was Noah. He couldn't use words either. I spent 12 years learning how to hear him anyway." A beat passed, carrying the full weight of the past tense. "He died 6 years ago. He was 14. Car accident. Nothing to do with his diagnosis, just the ordinary kind of terrible thing that happens." Vivian did not say she was sorry. She looked like she wanted to, but she also looked like she understood that sorry was insufficient, and that Marcus knew it was insufficient, and that offering it anyway would be a way of making herself feel better rather than honoring what he'd said. So instead, she was quiet, and the quality of her silence was different from the silence of the lobby. It was an active thing, a form of attention. After that, Marcus said, "I stopped wanting to do anything that asked much of me. I'd been doing advocacy work, running a parent support group, helping families navigate the school system, the medical system. All of it. After Noah, I couldn't. I took this job because it was honest and it was simple and it didn't require me to feel anything in particular. He looked around the lobby at the marble floors he had polished 10,000 times, at the elevator banks, at the high windows, letting in the morning light. I thought I was done with all of it. Turns out some things don't ask your permission before they start again. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she turned slightly and called to her assistant Claire, who had been hovering at a diplomatic distance throughout the entire exchange. "Get me a check," Vivian said. Claire nodded and began moving, and Marcus watched this with a still attentive expression that did not reveal what he was thinking. Vivian turned back to him and said, "I made an offer this morning in front of my entire staff. I keep my word." "I know you do," Marcus said. "That's not why I came forward." "I didn't say it was," Vivian replied. The check took 4 minutes. Claire brought it across the lobby on a leather portfolio, and Vivian signed it with the pen she kept in the inside pocket of her jacket, and then she held it out to Marcus with the straightforward manner of a person completing a transaction they believe in. $750,000 made out to Marcus Williams in the same hand that had signed acquisition agreements and restructuring plans, and the kind of documents that reshaped industries. Marcus took the check. He held it with both hands and looked at it for a long moment, not with longing and not with contempt, but with the considered attention of a man deciding something important. Then he looked up. "I don't want this," he said. Vivian's expression did not change. She had half expected it, though she couldn't have said why. "What I want," Marcus continued, "is for this to go towards something that actually helps. Not a specialist program, not another clinical framework. There are enough of those, and they do what they do, but they're not what most families need first." He looked at the check again, then back at Vivian. "What they need first is someone who's already been through it, sitting across the table and telling them what nobody told us, that their person is not broken, that they are communicating, that the job isn't to fix anything, but to learn the language." He folded the check once precisely along its center. "I want to build a place that does that, where parents who've been living this for years teach the parents who just got the diagnosis, where the expertise in the room isn't on the wall in a frame, but in the people sitting in the chairs." Dr. Price, who had remained within earshot through all of this, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a professional objection. She did not complete it. Vivian looked at Marcus for a long time. The lobby continued its slow return to ordinary function around them, phones buzzing, elevators opening and closing, the ambient percussion of a large organization resuming its business. None of it seemed to reach her. She was somewhere else, running something through her mind, with the focused private intensity she usually reserved for decisions worth several $100 million. This was worth more than that, and she knew it. "How long would it take to set up?" she asked. "Depends on the space and the structure," Marcus said. 6 months to open the doors if someone with resources wanted to move quickly. "I have resources," Vivian said. It was not a boast. It was a fact offered in the same register that Marcus had offered his own facts plainly without ornament. "I know," he said. Vivian extended her hand. Marcus took it, and they shook once with the gravity of two people who understand that what they are agreeing to is larger than the gesture that seals it. 6 months later, the Noah Williams Center opened in a converted building 12 blocks from Cole Enterprises, in a neighborhood that had more families navigating the school system and the medical system without enough support than it had resources to help them. The name had been Marcus's only condition. Vivian had agreed to it in the same moment he suggested it, without negotiation. The center was not a clinical facility. There were no intake forms in the front hallway and no framed credentials on the walls. What there was a large common room with good light and chairs arranged in circles, a resource library built from the recommendations of the families who used it, and a schedule that ran 6 days a week and consisted almost entirely of parents sitting together and talking. Fathers and mothers who had spent years learning to understand someone the world had not been designed for passing that knowledge to people who were still at the beginning of the same road. The expertise in the room was as Marcus had specified in the chairs. Dr. Price attended the opening. She came without announcement, stood near the back during the remarks, and stayed for 2 hours afterward, talking to families in the common room. As she was leaving, she stopped at the door and looked back at the room, at the circles of chairs, at the people in them, at the particular quality of attention that moves through a space where everyone present is both student and teacher. And something in her expression acknowledged a thing she had not been willing to acknowledge 6 months earlier in a marble lobby. Then she left, and Marcus noted it, and did not require anything more from the moment than what it was. Vivian came to the center on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after it opened. She did not come as a donor or as an executive. She came with Eli, and she sat down in one of the circles, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not the most powerful person in the room by any measure that mattered. She was a mother who was still learning in a room full of people in the same condition, and she sat with her hands in her lap and listened in the way that Marcus had stood in the lobby, and listened without agenda, without management, with nothing but the full and open attention of someone who has finally understood that this is where it starts. Marcus sat across the circle from her. At one point during the session, Eli looked across the room and found Marcus's face, and Marcus reached into the pocket of his jacket and held up the small blue car between 2 fingers, just for a second, just enough for Eli to see it. The boy's eyes settled on it with the particular focus of recognition, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that the people sitting near him noticed, and that Vivian, watching from across the circle, received the way you receive something you have been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting. Marcus put the car back in his pocket. The session continued. Outside the windows, the neighborhood went about its afternoon traffic and voices, and the ordinary, unstructured noise of a world that contained within it all the things that needed to be learned, and all the people still in the process of learning them. There was no summary that could hold what had changed. There was only the room and the people in it, and the continuous, unglamorous, essential work of paying attention to one another, which had always been available, which had never required a credential or a title or $750,000, and which had been waiting in the lobby of Cole Enterprises on an ordinary Tuesday morning for anyone willing to set down what they were carrying and sit on the floor. The people who change things rarely announce themselves. They show up, they pay attention, and they do the one thing that everyone else forgot to do: they listen. If that kind of story matters to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are more people like Marcus out there, and their stories deserve to be heard.